This lecture will be focusing on the age of Jackson. The age of Jackson really begins with the election of 1824, where John Quincy Adams went up against Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, whereas John Quincy Adams will end up winning the majority vote in the House. See, when Jackson won the popular vote, that didn't mean he won all the electoral votes he needed, so it went to the House of Representatives to be decided. Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House at the time, went against him. And so, with Clay supporting him, John Quincy Adams will become president. He will introduce the American system, which was, of course, talked about during the nationalism lectures, and Jackson will go on to create the Democratic Party. When Henry Clay supported John Quincy Adams, Adams gave him the position of Secretary of State. Jackson and his followers cried corrupt bargain. Secretary of State had been considered the stepping stone to the presidency. Many previous presidents, including John Quincy Adams, had served as Secretary of State beforehand. Now, there is no evidence that John Quincy Adams had given Henry Clay the position as a thank you for supporting him. Henry Clay was an amazing Secretary of State and probably the most qualified for the position. But since no evidence was found, the accusation still ruined both their reputations, both that of Henry Clay as well as John Quincy Adams. So in 1828, Jackson will run for president again under the platform of Old Hickory and the common man. He was a war hero from the War of 1812, and he believed himself to be like the common man. He was, born in the backwoods of Kentucky, pretty much a self-made millionaire, had taught himself, and with universal male suffrage, which meant that all white men had the right to vote. In other words, property qualifications was gone, those common people could and would vote for him. With the introduction of Jackson, Jackson's going to also bring a couple of different ideas to the presidency. The first one is the spoils system. To the victor belongs the spoils of the enemy. The idea was the incoming president could remove others from administrative positions and place those into office to help with their campaign. In other words, if you were working as the postmaster for Burke, you might be asked to leave that position to bring in someone who helped the current president get elected. That's the spoils system. Also, with rotation in office, Jackson would rotate certain officials out of positions in order to allow everyone to hold office. So you might only get the position as postmaster of Burke for 2 years before Jackson's going to rotate someone else in who also helped him get elected, so that everyone gets an opportunity to have a federal position. Both the spoils system and rotation in office are currently considered to be illegal because in order to take some of those jobs, you have to pass civil service exams. But that examination won't come till the end of the 1800s. Also, Jackson had the kitchen cabinet, which were friends of him who advised him on governmental and political affairs. See, the official cabinet has to be approved by Congress. So Jackson didn't rely on his official cabinet. Instead, he relied on his kitchen cabinet, a group of friends who helped him. Let's look at some major legislation from Jackson's administration. The first one is the Indian Removal Act. This happened in 1830. There were 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and Creek. They were called the 5 civilized tribes because many of them had a written language. They had assimilated to white culture, including, for example, the Cherokee, who even owned plantations and had slaves, similar to the whites in Georgia. With the Indian Removal Act of 1830, it forced Native Americans to abandon their lands and move west to the Plains territories. As we saw with Worcester versus Georgia, the Cherokee Nation fought for the right to keep their land. John Marshall ruled in their favor, but Jackson refused to uphold the Supreme Court's ruling. Thus, all of these Indians were forced to move on the Trail of Tears. They were first put in concentration camps along the Mississippi River until they could be ferried across the Mississippi and put into places like Oklahoma and what is now modern-day Oklahoma and Texas. The biggest problem for that is they didn't know how to cultivate any of that land, and none of it was their own, plus there were already Indians there. Thousands of civilized Indians will die, of the civilized tribes will die along this path. 5,000 Cherokee, 15,000 between the Chickasaw and the Choctaw. Thousands will die, which is why it got the name the Trail of Tears. Another piece of legislation was the Nullification Crisis. In 1828, there was a tariff called the Tariff of 1828, but the South called it the Tariff of Abominations because they felt that the tariff was so high, it was actually hurting them rather than helping them. So John C. Calhoun, who was vice president under Jackson, reintroduced the nullification theory with his South Carolina exposition and protest. And so South Carolina will say that they're going to nullify the Tariff of Abominations. And they even go a step further and say that they will secede from the Union if the tariff is not repealed. So Jackson's going to respond in two ways. The first one is with the compromise tariff. With the tariff of 1833, we're going to see the tariff rate lowered over the next 10 years. Clay created the tariff. He's sort of known as the great compromiser between the compromise tariff, the Missouri Compromise, and the Compromise of 1850. Then Jackson will also have the Force Act, where he threatened to take the tariff by force. He said that he would march the army down and collect the tariff if South Carolina did not pay. This is going to uphold the Supremacy Clause as well as the position of the federal government. Then you have the Bank of the United States. Remember, the Bank of the United States was introduced by Hamilton in 1796, and it had been rechartered in 1816. Jackson hated the bus because he believed that it protected and supported Northerners and wanted to destroy it. So one of the things that he's going to do is he's going to withdraw federal funds from the bus and put them in state banks. Now, these state banks got the nickname Wildcat Banks or Pet Banks. Pet banks because they're sort of the pets of the federal government, because the federal government is going to honor them. But they also get the name Wildcat because they're unpredictable and you can't rely on them. Remember when we talked about the banking industry, the Bank of the United States is supposed to provide a stable bank where stable credit could be issued. Now they're moved into state banks that are unstable, which could create an economic crisis. So in 1836, the bus was up for a new charter, and it does not get renewed. Jackson actually vetoed the charter. And so a new political party will be formed in response to this. It will be began by Henry Clay, and it's called the Whig Party, and it's going to go up against Jacksonian Democrats. They supported the bus, a strong central government, and American industry. Along with all of these other things, there was the continued discussion about slavery and how slavery would expand into the new territories. During this time, we had the Hayne-Webster debates, which were sectional debates about Western lands and whether or not slavery should extend. After the Hayne-Webster debates, it was decided that slavery created too much controversy in Congress, and so Congress enacted the gag rule, which said that slavery could not be discussed for many years, from 1836 to 1844. John Quincy Adams, who had gone from being president back to being a congressman, fought this for as long as he was in Congress and tried to introduce slavery to the Congress floor on a regular basis, but they would not hear him. And this is why, for example, when Texas tries to become a state in 1836, it cannot be discussed because the gag rule is in place, and so Congress couldn't hear a state constitution from a state that was going to be introducing slavery. Now remember those pet banks? Well, they're going to become somewhat unstable. And so in 1837, we're going to have our panic. A panic is an economic depression. So in May 1837, the pet banks began to crumble and fall. We see a run on the banks. And so that's when American people go and withdraw their money from the banks so that more banks crumble and fall and American industry doesn't prosper. Martin Van Buren was president during this time. He had been Jackson's second vice president, and he is going to be dealing with the Panic of 1837 and Indian removal, and he will lose a lot of popular support because of this. So in 1840, we have another election, and this will be the election of Harrison and Tyler. Harrison runs on the platform Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because of course he was the hero at the Battle of Tippecanoe just prior to the War of 1812. He's a Whig, and when he goes up to give his campaign, when he campaigns as a common man. He says, I just like to sit at my log cabin and have some hard cider. So he really appeals to that common man and that war hero platform. But of course, when he becomes president, he gives a 3-hour-long speech, which means that he catches pneumonia, and within a month of office, he actually dies. And now Tyler, who is more of a Democrat, is now president of the United States. And we have to sort of deal with how does power transfer, because his excellency is now president, and we had never before had a vice president take over for the president while the president's term is still in office. And so when we move into the 1840s, next we'll be focusing on a period of manifest destiny.